1 year ago, a wildfire in the Grand Canyon showed the entire country exactly what happens when a fire crosses the line from serious to genuinely out of control. The Dragon Bravo fire ignited on the North Rim from a single lightning strike on July 4th, 2025. For its first 2.5 weeks, officials managed it with a strategy called confine and contain, clearing fuel around it rather than attacking it aggressively, betting that the surrounding terrain would help hold it in place. Then, in a single week in late July, it grew from roughly 13,000 acres to more than 94,000. Containment collapsed from 26% down to just 4%. Within days, it tore through the historic Grand Canyon Lodge, the only lodge on the canyon's north rim, along with nearly 100 other structures. By September, it had burned close to 150,000 acres, becoming one of the most destructive fires in National Park Service history. Earlier this year, the federal government's own Interior Secretary publicly admitted that a different early response, aggressive suppression instead of the initial confine and contain approach, might have saved hundreds of millions of dollars in historic structures. That is what it looks like when a wildfire genuinely spirals out of control, and it is the exact pattern currently playing out again, this time in north central Washington, on a fire that, as of this week, remains almost entirely uncontained. Today, we are going to walk through what actually happened at the Grand Canyon last year, why federal officials now say it was preventable, and why this year's Sinlahekin fire in Washington is showing some of the same early warning signs, using only confirmed reporting and official statements, not speculation. If tracking how wildfires actually spiral out of control, and what officials are doing differently this time, is something you want to keep following. Subscribing means you catch the next update the moment new information comes in. Let's go back to the Grand Canyon first, because understanding exactly where that response went wrong is the key to understanding why officials are watching this year's fires so closely. The Dragon Bravo fire began the way an enormous share of western wildfires do, a lightning strike in remote terrain, this one on the Grand Canyon's North Rim on Independence Day 2025. In its earliest stage, fire managers made a deliberate strategic choice. Rather than moving immediately to full suppression, they opted to manage it, using a confine and contain approach, a strategy that involves clearing fuel sources around the fire's edges and using natural and constructed barriers to hold it in place while allowing it to continue burning within that boundary. This is a legitimate, commonly used wildfire management strategy, and it is not inherently reckless. Fire managers use it specifically in situations where a controlled burn can reduce dangerous fuel buildup in a landscape that benefits ecologically from periodic fire without requiring the full resource commitment of aggressive suppression. Forest ecosystems across the American West evolved alongside regular, low-intensity fire for thousands of years before modern firefighting existed, and decades of aggressively suppressing every single ignition, no matter how small, has left many landscapes loaded with dense, unnaturally accumulated fuel that would have periodically burned off on its own in a healthier fire cycle. Confine and contain strategies exist specifically to capture some of that ecological benefit, letting a naturally ignited fire clear out that dangerous fuel buildup under conditions considered favorable, rather than either suppressing it entirely or letting it burn completely unmanaged. Under the right weather conditions, this approach genuinely works, and land managers across the country use it successfully on a regular basis. The Dragon Bravo decision was not in itself an obviously reckless call at the time it was made, which is exactly why the after-action criticism has focused less on the initial strategic choice and more on how quickly officials recognized and responded to the moment conditions stopped favoring that approach. For roughly 2.5 weeks, that approach appeared to be working, with the fire growing slowly and remaining well short of any serious threat to structures or communities. Then conditions changed fast. Hot temperatures, low humidity, and strong wind gusts combined in late July to push the fire's growth into an entirely different category. By July 22nd, the fire had reached only 13,662 acres, with crews holding 26% containment numbers that suggested a manageable situation. 1 week later, on July 30th, the fire had exploded to 94,228 acres, and containment had collapsed to just 4%. That single week represents one of the more dramatic wildfire reversals recorded in recent National Park Service history, a fire that appeared reasonably under control, transforming in a matter of days into a genuine emergency. Part of what made the Grand Canyon's North Rim such a uniquely difficult place to contain a fire once it escalated has to do with the canyon itself. A public information officer working the incident described the canyon as behaving almost like an enormous natural fire break on one hand, while simultaneously funneling wind through its terrain and generating its own unpredictable, difficult, local weather patterns on the other, a genuinely double-edged geographic feature. Steep, remote terrain along much of the north rim also limited where crews could safely build direct containment line by hand or machine, forcing more reliance on slower, indirect strategies precisely when speed mattered most. The combination, extreme local wind effects layered on top of terrain too rugged for straightforward suppression tactics, is part of why a fire that had been holding steady for 2.5 weeks could unravel so completely once conditions turned against it. Fire officials shifted strategy to aggressive suppression roughly a week after the explosive growth began, but by then the fire had already grown to more than 7.5 square miles and showed no signs of slowing. The consequences arrived almost immediately. On the night of July 12th and into July 13th, the fire tore through the North Rim's developed area, destroying the historic Grand Canyon Lodge, the only lodging inside the canyon on its north rim, and a structure with decades of history as one of the park's most recognizable landmarks, along with approximately 100 other buildings. All staff and residents evacuated safely, and officials reported no injuries or fatalities from the blaze itself, but the physical loss was severe enough that the National Park Service closed the North Rim entirely for the remainder of the 2025 season. A chlorine gas leak, triggered when fire damaged a water treatment facility, forced additional evacuations and closures across popular trails, including the North and South Kaibab Trails and Phantom Ranch, compounding the disruption well beyond the immediate burn area. By early August, the fire had crossed 111,000 acres and officially reached what the U.S. Forest Service classifies as Megafire status, a designation reserved specifically for wildfires that burn past 100,000 acres, a threshold reached by only a small fraction of fires nationwide each year. The fire continued growing through August, eventually reaching approximately 145,000 acres before crews finally secured 94% containment by late September, nearly 3 full months after it first ignited from a single lightning strike. The loss of the Grand Canyon Lodge in particular became a genuine national story, well beyond typical wildfire coverage, precisely because of what the structure represented. Visitors who had booked stays at the lodge months in advance, including families traveling from overseas specifically to experience the North Rim, arrived at the park only to learn the building no longer existed, forced to redirect to the busier, more developed South Rim instead. One traveler, describing the loss to a local news crew, called it a mixture of still enjoying the trip while being acutely aware that a meaningful piece of the park's natural and architectural history had been destroyed. That kind of visible, tangible loss, a specific, beloved, physically irreplaceable structure reduced to rubble, is often what turns a wildfire from a regional news story into the kind of event a federal cabinet secretary ends up publicly commenting on nearly a year later. The aftermath of Dragon Bravo has become a genuine case study in wildfire management, decision-making, and the federal government's own retrospective assessment has been unusually candid. Earlier this year, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum directly addressed the fire's early management, stating plainly that, in retrospect, an approach centered on suppression rather than the initial confine and contain strategy might have, saved hundreds of millions of dollars in historic properties, including the Grand Canyon Lodge itself. That kind of direct acknowledgement from a sitting cabinet official is genuinely rare in wildfire management. Most agencies are considerably more guarded when discussing whether an active disaster response could have gone differently, and it reflects just how significant the loss at Dragon Bravo was considered within the federal government's own after-action review. That review did not stop at acknowledging past mistakes either. It appears to be actively shaping current season decision-making. Federal land management agencies have been more publicly vocal this year about shifting toward faster initial suppression responses on new ignitions in high-value or high-visibility areas, rather than defaulting to a wait and monitor posture, a shift that directly traces back to the specific criticism leveled at Dragon Bravo's early handling. Whether that shift in posture reaches every single new fire ignition across the country, including smaller, more remote fires like Sinlahekin was in its first few days, is a genuinely open question, since resource constraints and competing priorities across an already severe fire season inevitably shape how aggressively any individual new ignition can be met in its earliest hours. The core lesson officials have drawn from Dragon Bravo is not that confine and contain is always the wrong strategy. It remains a legitimate and often appropriate tool. The lesson is about how quickly conditions can shift, and how a strategy that makes sense under one set of weather conditions can become dangerously inadequate within days once temperatures spike, humidity drops, and wind picks up. Exactly the combination that turned Dragon Bravo from a slow-growing, well-contained fire into a fire that lost 9/10 of its containment in a single week. That lesson is precisely why this year's fires are being watched with a different level of urgency than in past seasons, and why one fire currently burning in Washington state deserves particular attention right now. The Sinlahaken fire ignited from a lightning strike roughly 12 miles west of Tonasket, Washington, in Okanogan County on July 26, 2026. Its early trajectory has already echoed some of the same warning signs that defined Dragon Bravo's turning point. By July 31st, 5 days after ignition, it had grown to roughly 30,000 acres, still at 0% containment. Then, driven by strong winds over the following weekend, it more than doubled in just 2 days, reaching nearly 74,000 acres by August 2nd, still with 0% containment as spot fires. Embers carried well ahead of the main fire ignited new pockets of flame miles beyond the established perimeter. By August 4th, the fire had crossed 100,000 acres, officially reaching Megafire status, the same threshold Dragon Bravo crossed roughly 2.5 weeks after its own explosive growth phase began. As of August 5th, the most recent confirmed update, Sinlahaken sits at 117,078 acres, with containment at just 9%, a level of control comparable to where Dragon Bravo stood during its worst week, not its eventual recovery. To be clear about what we do and do not know at this stage, Sinlahaken is not a repeat of Dragon Bravo. It is a different fire in a different state, burning through different terrain, and officials have not made any public statements suggesting its early management involved the same kind of confine and contain strategy that drew criticism in Arizona. What makes the comparison genuinely useful, rather than simply alarmist, is the shared underlying pattern. A fire that spent its early days appearing manageable, then encountered a specific combination of heat, low humidity, and wind that turned it into a fire capable of doubling in size within a matter of days, precisely the volatility that turned Dragon Bravo from a contained situation into one of the most destructive fires in National Park Service history. Sinlahaken is burning through shortgrass fuel. Terrain officially classified at around 1 foot in height, conditions known for producing exactly this kind of explosive, wind-driven growth, and as of the most recent reporting, its containment progress has essentially stalled between August 4th and August 5th, holding in place rather than genuinely advancing, a pattern that leaves the fire capable of renewed rapid growth the moment conditions shift again. Shortgrass fuels behave very differently from the mixed conifer, aspen, and ponderosa pine that fed the Dragon Bravo fire on the Grand Canyon's forested north rim, and that distinction matters for how each fire's danger actually plays out. Grass ignites and spreads dramatically faster than timber once wind is involved, which is exactly why Sinlahaken's growth chart shows sudden, dramatic, multi-day jumps, rather than the more gradual escalation timber fires like Dragon Bravo typically show in their early weeks. But grass also burns out faster and more completely than timber, leaving less residual fuel to smolder and reignite behind an established line, which is part of why fire behavior analysts generally expect a grass fire, once genuinely contained, to stay contained more reliably than a forest fire, working through heavy downed logs and duff. The two fires' fuel types point toward different eventual outcomes, even while sharing the same alarming early trajectory right now. Fire officials have described isolated pockets of unburned fuel continuing to smolder and flare up well within sections of the perimeter that might otherwise look secure on a map. Exactly the kind of lingering activity that keeps a containment percentage from climbing, even when a fire's overall acreage has largely stopped expanding, a pattern that echoes, in its own way, the isolated flare-ups crews continued fighting even during Dragon Bravo's eventual march toward full containment months after its worst week. More than 1,500 personnel are now assigned to Sinlahaken under a Type 1 incident management team, the highest complexity classification used for the country's most demanding wildfire operations, a scale of response that reflects lessons learned from exactly the kind of underestimated early threat that defined Dragon Bravo's trajectory. Level 3. Go now. Evacuation orders have expanded repeatedly as the fire's footprint has grown, now covering broad areas west of the Okanogan River, north to Oroville, along with the Totes Coulee, Gold Hill, and Loomis areas, and the Pine Creek corridor. A shelter has operated out of the Community Cultural Center in Tonasket, and multiple roads, including sections of Sinlahaken Road and several Forest Service routes, have remained closed for extended stretches. Suppression costs have already climbed past $12 million, with that figure certain to keep rising for as long as the fire remains this far from secured. Washington's broader wildfire season provides important context for why a fire like Sinlahaken can struggle to attract the fastest possible resource buildup, even with lessons from Dragon Bravo fresh in officials' minds. The state entered August already managing at least a dozen major wildfires simultaneously under a statewide emergency, declared by Governor Bob Ferguson, including the larger, more established Kaiser Canyon fire nearby, which ignited 10 days before Sinlahaken and has since reached roughly 48% containment, a dramatically different trajectory than Sinlahaken's own. Every additional fire competing for the same limited pool of aircraft, hand crews, and specialized management teams makes it genuinely difficult to front-load overwhelming resources onto every new ignition the moment it starts, even when officials are acutely aware from recent history of how quickly conditions can turn a manageable fire into a genuine emergency. This is precisely the tension sitting underneath this entire comparison. Dragon Bravo's after-action review suggests that faster, more aggressive early suppression could have prevented catastrophic losses. But faster, more aggressive early suppression requires resources, and resources are exactly what a state, fighting a dozen simultaneous major wildfires under a statewide emergency declaration, has the least of despair on any single new ignition. Sinlahekin did not necessarily receive a slower response because officials failed to learn Dragon Bravo's lessons and may simply have ignited into a fire season so severe, statewide, that even a fully committed response still could not outpace explosive, wind-driven growth through short grass terrain. That distinction matters enormously for how fairly this comparison should be read. The lesson from Dragon Bravo is real, and officials appear to be applying it, but lessons about strategy cannot manufacture additional firefighters, aircraft, and incident management teams out of thin air during a season when nearly every region of the state needs all three at once. There is one more parallel worth drawing out explicitly, because it cuts against a comfortable assumption many people make about wildfire risk. The Grand Canyon is one of the most visited, most carefully monitored national parks in the entire federal system, with dedicated fire management staff, extensive historical data on the North Rim's fire behavior, and enormous public and media attention focused on it the moment any fire ignites nearby. If a fire in a location that closely watched could still escalate as fast and as destructively as Dragon Bravo did, it is worth taking seriously that a fire in a comparatively less closely watched rural stretch of Okanogan County, however well-resourced this particular response has become, carries no inherent immunity from a similar trajectory simply because it lacks the same level of national visibility. Attention and resources tend to follow a fire's size and destructiveness, not precede it, which is precisely the dynamic that let Dragon Bravo's early weeks pass with comparatively little public notice before its explosive turn made it a national story. Plan, not simply background noise in a weather forecast. Keep a go bag packed and ready year-round if you live in fire-prone terrain, since both Dragon Bravo and Sinlahekin demonstrated that a fire can move from a contained, low-priority news item to a fast-moving emergency within a matter of days. Know your area's evacuation level system before a notice ever reaches you, and follow official sources like InciWeb and your state's wildfire portal directly for current containment status, since, as both of these fires show, official updates can shift dramatically between one report and the next. If you manage or oversee property near a fire-prone landscape, whether a business, a ranch, or a historic structure like the one lost at the Grand Canyon, consider what Dragon Bravo's aftermath actually revealed about advanced planning. Not just evacuation readiness, but structural protection measures taken well before any fire threat is imminent. Defensible space clearing, fire-resistant roofing where feasible, and clearly documented emergency contacts for structure protection crews all make a measurable difference in whether a threatened building survives an approaching fire or becomes another entry on a list of structures lost. And none of those measures can be arranged effectively in the handful of hours between an evacuation order and a fire's arrival. The Dragon Bravo fire is now a closed chapter, fully contained since late September of last year, its lessons already influencing how officials are talking about fire strategy in real time this season. The Sinlahekin fire is not a closed chapter. It is an active, evolving situation, sitting at a stage of containment that should look familiar to anyone who followed what happened in the Grand Canyon last summer. And whether it follows Dragon Bravo's path toward eventual catastrophic structure loss, or instead follows a path closer to Kaiser Canyon's steadier recovery, remains a genuinely open question as this video is being made. We will keep tracking Sinlahekin and the rest of the West's active megafires as new containment numbers come in. If you want those updates the moment they land, subscribing is the way to make sure you do not miss them. And if you were affected by the Dragon Bravo fire last year, or you're watching Sinlahekin unfold near you right now, tell us in the comments what you think officials have actually learned since last summer, because the honest answer to that question is still being written in real time, one containment update at a time on a fire that has not yet told us how its own story ends. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one.